Hi, I'm Hunter. Today we're going to look at my computer from 2010. And there it is. Now, this case is not from 2010. The case is much older. But what I did was I bought a different case for my computer in 2010, and I hated it so much that I ended up migrating my system back into this case. That case, in case you're wondering, is this case right here. It's the Lian Li PC-V352. I was sort of expecting a shuttle-style shoebox kind of system, but this just became a really big headache. This case cost a lot of money. It's all aluminum. This is the silver one, so it looks like that inside. Anyway, it's really tight and complex, and in spite of the fact that I sort of figured the shape would save space or something, in spite of its tight clearances, it really doesn't save any space. This was sitting on the top of my desk, and because of the shape of it, it just pretty much takes up more space than a normal desktop tower like this does, sitting beneath a desk. And the thing about this Lian Li is it was just a huge headache. I bought a graphics card specifically so that it would just barely fit into the case. As you can see, the drive bays are on the side, which is kind of weird. And I don't know. Anytime you needed to get into that case or do anything with it, you kind of had to disassemble the computer every single time. It was miserable. There were some nice features to it, but bottom line is I got sick of it, and I ended up using my old case that I had from way back when, which I like a lot better. This case needs a little work. In particular, I want to get a DVD RAM capable optical drive that it does not have a black bezel, which is kind of a difficult task, and ideally it wouldn't have a black disk tray as well, but that may be asking just too much of this black world. And this case got kind of banged up over the years by various people. Would also like to treat these plastic surfaces, because as you can see, this is the proper color of the case and the plastics are yellowing, so it's not that bad, but it does need to be treated. Right, let's look at the back. Okay. First off, we've got a USB wireless adapter right here. Again, I built this system to fit into the Lian Li case where there's no room for anything. I could have potentially wedged a wireless card in there, but it seemed like a bad idea for airflow reasons and just for the ability to actually get in there and do anything. So I got this Rosewill. Let's see. I can read it, but I want the camera to read it. RNX N180 UBE. An adapter, which is, of course, out of date now, but hey, that's kind of the point of this video, isn't it? To show what was what way back when. Let's see. We got PS2 ports. They don't have those anymore. This is a USB 2 board, which in retrospect was kind of a, well, I don't want to say it was the wrong decision, but it was a pragmatic decision at the time. In late 2010, you could get USB 3 motherboards and also serial ATA3 boards, but I didn't, partially because I didn't want to pay the premium for it, partially because it wasn't a really big deal in 2010, and partially because by getting a very advanced motherboard, I would have to give up certain features that I wanted in a motherboard, which I'll show you in a minute. And we got our integrated sound. This particular board has an external serial ATA port here and here. Looks like we got a 1394 port, never used it. Here's our graphics card down here, and here is an upside down power supply. This is not the original power supply. Actually, I have that. This was the original power supply. For reasons of brevity, I'm not going to get it out, but it's a fanless power supply, and it was really nice. Cost a lot of money. Silver. Very good looking power supply, by the way. Anyway, after about 7 years, it broke on me while I was watching a video, so that is why I replaced it with this Seasonic, which is also a fanless power supply, as is sort of implied by this. Of course, usually when they put fans on power supplies now, they put them on the bottom or top of the unit, and they use a, like a 120 millimeter fan. Keeps noise down and moves more air. However, this is actually a fanless power supply. So anyway, it's always a compromise, especially when you go for a fanless power supply, but Seasonic builds some of the best ones out there, and so I got this one. And the reason it's upside down is because apparently these days, let's open this up. The screws are obviously out, but apparently these days power supplies are placed at the bottom of cases, I guess, and they're flipped around, and well, anyway, that's how this one has its holes drilled, and I wasn't going to drill into my case. The documentation for this power supply says, don't turn it over, don't install it upside down. And then it says, but if you do install it upside down, make sure there's airflow on the top of it. Well, clearly there is no airflow up here, but, well, it's a well-made power supply with good tolerances, and part of that includes how much power it can actually produce. And efficiency is, in part, a measure of how much heat it produces when it's running. So it's a pretty efficient power supply. It's pretty well made. It's pretty heat tolerant. And what can I say? The heatsink is actually up here on the top. And, yeah, this was my first modular power supply. So that was pretty cool. Got to only plug in when I needed and not add anything else. And here we go. This is a, what is it? A mini ATX board. See how small the board is in comparison to the case? Well, it was all made for the Liaoning. This is an i5 750 system. I got a Zalman Flower something or other heatsink and fan there to replace the Intel heatsink and fan. The Intel one isn't bad at all, actually, and I actually used it for a couple of years after I put the system together. However, eventually I decided to experiment with this, and I have to say, it's pretty terrible. So I'm going to be replacing it. Maybe I'll do a video on that. 4 gigabytes of memory here. I guess this is DDR3 according to what that label says. Oh, let's see. We got GTX 460 NVIDIA card here. Can't really see in there, can we? Well, maybe we can. And yeah, made by Gigabyte. The idea behind this card was sort of a compromise between speed, price, and how quiet it was, and how, like, I could get this into the Leon Lee case, but it was just about touching on every side, which is one of the reasons I had to kind of disassemble the computer every single time I wanted to do anything in there. You couldn't open anything without disconnecting every wire and moving everything else out of the way, and it was just awful. Nothing else in here. Don't have a sound card installed, mostly because I just, well, I don't mind the onboard sound that much. I've had sound cards before, and I mean, they're all right, but they're kind of just one more thing to deal with. Got to put drivers in, and they do fail. You wouldn't think a sound card would break on you, but, well, it's happened to me. That's creative for you. And up in here, we've got, somewhere in here, it's in there. It's right in there. In there. We've got, the original disk is in there. It's a solid state drive. It's an Intel X25M, 80 gigabytes, which was a great deal at the time that I got it. And I mean, it was always a great deal. It was a low-priced disk, reasonable amount of space you could actually work with. Of course, it's not one of those, massive disks, but it had enough for you to actually get by on. And it was the first MLC SSD that was really reliable. They had, of course, SLC drives before that were, fine, but they were very expensive. And the Intel X25M is the first SSD that's actually, the first MLC drive that's actually usable because it will not corrupt your data. And it never broke. It's still in here. I don't use it as a primary disk anymore. On the top here is a Samsung 840 Pro. I think that might be 256 gigabytes. That is a serial ATA3 disk, and as I said, this is not a serial ATA3 board. I tried putting a controller in here, and it did increase the disk speed, but it made booting slower, and it caused so many other problems. I didn't have a hard drive light because it was just, I don't know, it just wasn't working. The pinouts just weren't working. That would be this guy right here. Right here. And it caused corruption in the other disk. Why? I don't know. It just did. It just caused corruption. I have no idea why. It didn't matter if I had the two disks on the same controller or on different controllers, because there would be a PCI... There would be a PCI Express one-speed controller in here, and then there's the onboard controller whose sockets are right there. And yeah, it caused so many problems I took it out. So these disks run on serial ATA2, even though the top one is a serial ATA3 disk, and is therefore it saturates the controller. And it also saturated the PCI Express bus when I had the controller in there. And because of the stupid design of these boards, there's two 16-speed PCI Express slots here. One here and one that the graphics card is plugged into. Well, as it turns out, they don't split evenly. The top slot gets more bandwidth allocated to it than the bottom one does. So I could either choose more frames per second in rendering or more megabytes per second in reading and writing. And, traditionally you sort of think, well, the bottleneck is the disk. But as it turned out, those extra megabytes per second, they don't really do anything for me. So I kept the graphic, I chose frames per second. That was a bigger bottleneck for me. The optical drive, as mentioned, is just this, random old. I got it because it could read pretty much everything except Blu-ray. It's not a Blu-ray drive. I got a floppy drive here. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you why I got this motherboard. So, I kind of wanted backwards compatibility. You will notice that this drive has an ATA port or slot or pins right here. And it also has a floppy connector right in there somewhere. Whoa, did not mean to do that. Anyway, it's right here behind the power connector, which is black and therefore really hard to see. And at the time, and this board also has a BIOS, not a UEFI. So at the time, a lot of motherboards were dropping these things. And there's also a PCI slot right here. That, can't get my finger in there. That is a PCI slot. So, and again, at the time I thought, yeah, maybe I'd like to put a sound card in there, or maybe I'd like to do something with backwards compatibility. I used to do that. I'd had an Athlon 64 system with the floppy setup, and I actually had a 5 1/4 inch drive in it too, because it was just fun, and it helped me interface the new computer with older computers that had those drives. And I kind of wanted the same thing for this computer, which is why I made it a point that I wanted the PCI slot, I wanted the ATA slot, I wanted the floppy capability, and a lot of motherboards were dropping support for those. And guess what? All of the boards with serial ATA 3 and USB 3 are the boards that didn't have those features that I wanted. So in a way, I was kind of forced over here if I wanted those features at all. I actually saw a Dell system from about 10 years ago. Still had floppies, and it was a Windows Vista system. So did not have the ATA connectors, which honestly are kind of not as important. Although, I mean, if you just have a particular optical drive you want to use, then you might want it. And you can't really add these in. There's no add-in card, basically. There's no add-in card that you can just add a floppy controller through PCI Express or even PCI. Now, there are floppy controllers for ISA, but that's a whole other topic. Got one fan here simply because this fan does a pretty terrible job of everything. I mean, it's not, the computer's stable, but this fan the heatsink just does not keep the processor cool. It will just get too hot under load, and it's going to be replaced. But the reason I have a case fan here is just to help it out. Another spot for a case fan here. I used to have one. I used to want to pack everything in there and keep it real busy, but now I don't want to do that, and I'd rather have less stuff in there, less power draw, less noise. And also, there's no filters on this case, so it gets really dusty. I cleaned it out before the video, but it does get dusty. The Lian Li, back in that direction, that one actually has filters on the you can see the front of the case has this grill here. Behind here are two 120 millimeter fans, and there's filters on them, and it does a beautiful job of keeping the inside of the case dust free. That's one of the good things about the Lian Li case, but the bad kind of outweighed the good, unfortunately. Oh yeah, I installed XP on it. which was, it was old-fashioned. It was quite old-fashioned in 2010. People were the current system was pretty much Windows 7 in 2010. But I figured, you know what, I can still do it one more time, so I'm going to do it one more time, and I did. And since that time, obviously, compatibility has gone down a steep hill for XP. A lot of things have been broken over the years, not by me, but by web developers and the like, who do things that that don't always work in the software that developers have left on XP. And there's advantages and disadvantages to using an old operating system. Advantages are backwards compatibility and just the interface. It's a nicer interface. There's less animation. Things aren't as buried in menus, and the system requirements are lower. Disadvantages are compatibility for newer stuff is actually really bad now, and there's certain features that aren't available, and also when you use an old operating system, you kind of become disconnected from the rest of the community and out there. People don't know what your struggles are anymore because they have different operating systems that are better supported, and they don't know what you're talking about when you're going through some particular problem. So I'm probably not going to do that again, but the system here is XP. And I also put in a Windows 7 installation on the X25M that I replaced. I wasn't doing anything with it for years. And finally, I just threw Windows 7 on it so I could run other programs that required Windows 7 because, well, basically just because developers are lazy and they don't support other operating systems. Not like there's anything about XP that wouldn't run these programs, but they just choose not to do it. Also, it's 32-bit, so, I mean, that's a separate issue, but 32-bit, so of these 4 gigabytes, in effect, 3 of them can be addressed. 3 gigabytes can be addressed. And the Windows 7 installation is 64-bit, so it will address all 4 gigabytes. 4 gigabytes, that's really small now, isn't it? But, in 2010 it was kind of small back then, too. You could easily get 8 or 16 gigabytes in 2010, but again, 32 bits, that's kind of all I could really have, so I just got 4 gigabytes, and, it works. So, that concludes a review of this computer from 2010.